Here's what's coming up on today's show.
When we took that loss, it was to offset taxes that he for sure would pay out in the future rather than just going, well, I've got a stock that's down and I'm going to have to pay taxes.
Welcome to the How Money Works podcast with Craig and Jennifer Moser of Maestro Wealth Advisors, serving you throughout the Triad of North Carolina for more than 30 years.
We're going to do some finances with Forrest. And I mean Forrest
Gump.
Forrest Gump, yeah.
Forrest Gump.
Okay.
So since we've done, athletes and political figures and writers and fictional characters before, we might as well try this one because he's got some certainly quotable moments in the movie. So we'll have a little fun with this. I'll let you guys spin some sort of financial yarn off of some classic Forrest Gump quotes. So we got to start with the big one. Everybody knows the big one. Like Mama always said, life's like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Give me the financial spin, Craig.
So I'll give you some. About a year ago, we had a lovely young lady on one of our radio shows. She had experienced a devastating event.
That's right,
She was around 32 years old, lovely lady, very professional, and one night her husband just passed away in her early 30s, he as well. And she just wasn't prepared for that. So here's the backstory to that. She had reached out to us and said, I would like to talk to you guys to see if we want to engage for a financial plan. And
this is prior to the passing of her husband.
Yeah, and so we were so excited to meet her. And so we met her and went through some data. And her job was to collect other information so that we could do some analysis, what have you. So we booked us another appointment to go over that information, and then she called and canceled. And I'm like, what happened? And so she was very excited, and so I called her, and she said, my husband died last night. And I, was speechless, to be frank with you. I didn't know what to say. And so here's what we did. They didn't have a will. They were very young, and a lot of people in that age bracket, there is no tomorrow, so they hadn't done that yet. Although that was on one of the checkpoints that we said we would want to work through with them, and she wished she'd come sooner, is what she said, and so they didn't have that will together, nor did they have assets, various different accounts and things titled properly. He owned cars in just his name. She owned accounts. He had accounts. And so it was quite a bit of work to go through that. And so that part of the plan, it took us some time. So we weren't focused on here, let's get invested. We were focused on, how easily are we going to be able to help this person transition what had happened and try to get her where she needed to be. My joke always is that if you want to make God laugh, you make a plan. But also as a certified financial planner, you have to plan. I mean, you look forward and say, here is my intent. Here are the things that I want to have happen. And how is the most efficient and best way we can approach that? So that's the puzzle that a certified financial planner loves to look at and say, let's take this and shape it and form it and make sure that it ends up in a direction and the plan actually works, not just up front, but over time.
So this lovely lady, they weren't expecting this predeceased, or an early demise of her husband, and they didn't make that plan. So, you never know what you're going to get, right? And that's what she was dealt, and she had to deal with it at that time. Another person we met with for quite some time, they went through a divorce. They weren't expecting a divorce, and
you're dancing around this. Let me do it.
All right.
So we had clients for a long time, and there were issues with the marriage. I'm not going to get into that, but one day I get the phone call, and we're having a divorce. So the female in this, she was pretty well organized. She knew what the assets were. She knew what she wanted, whereas the man was not happy with this situation and was very upset. He was very upset. Okay. And so what happened was we had to work through both sides. So both sides, one side is pretty logical and had approached it well, and the other one was was very emotional and reactionary, and we had to kind of talk that person off of the ledge a little bit. Look, this happened to you. We're very sorry. We didn't have anything to do with it, but the bottom line here are the steps that you should take if you want to make this work out well. And for her, it went very easily. For him, it was a battle because it just wasn't, he just didn't like it. And so when you're looking at a box of chocolates, if you will, those were a couple that were not something that he enjoyed. But again, the whole idea behind this is, since you don't know what's coming up in front of you every day, you need to have contingencies, redundancies, and things in place to make sure that, your plan, in our case for retirement, is still going to function and
under different scenarios.
Yeah,
right.
and still come out the way it should, I guess is the way to say it.
Yeah.
Right. So we're talking about famous phrases from Forrest Gump and relating that to the people that we meet and the solutions that we find to kind of go with those phrases. Our number is 336-448-1086, Maestro Wealth. If you hear something that resonates with you, just pick up the phone and give us a call and set an appointment to get your finances in order. 336-448-1086. Craig, what about Mama always said, you've got to put the past behind you before you can move on?
There are things like that. Sometimes people get really hung up on things that they wish they had done different in the past. I will give you the Craig story. So my wife has a good eye for real estate. She's very good at picking good stuff. So I can remember there was a piece of property downtown Winston-Salem. And we went, and I was kind of like, oh, God, what would we do with this? How much would it cost to fix it up? I was looking at what it cost. She looked at it for what it was going to be. And now there's a great big old skyscraper right there where that building used to be.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, I should have bought that, And there were other things like that. So you can look back in your past, I know I can, and say, I wish I had done that rather than not. So
Let's talk a little bit
But you can't
about
dwell
a
on it,
client.
right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and let's talk about a client who I wasn't able to convince you to come off the past, but you were able to make something good out of something that happened where a client bought an IPO.
right.
Pretty well positioned on that pricing. It went, it basically tripled in value, went up to 46. You had encouraged him to say, you might want to go ahead and take some profit here. He's like, no, kind of like my little baby, I'm going to. And then he forgot about it.
Trees grow to heaven. Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it tanks, basically.
Right.
Yeah. And you're like, all right, yeah, we talked about this. You should have taken some profit. Now it's way down. Why don't you've got some other things that are happening in your financial life this year. Why don't you go ahead and sell it at a loss? Take that loss and you can offset some other things that are happening in your finances this year. And if you really like the fundamentals of this stock, why don't you just wait 31 days and then you can buy it back if the price looks good at that time and if you think that there's still, forward and an upward momentum. And that's exactly what he did, right?
Well, it took a little while to get past the I'm taking a loss part. We bought it back. So that thing runs back up to about $20. So I made that phone call again. You probably ought to defend this position. Well, this time he was
listening a little bit.
Paying attention, yeah. So unfortunately, from a tax perspective, that short-term gain is in his taxable. He's going to pay taxes on it this calendar year. But my argument about taking profits and paying taxes is if you make money, you'll have to pay taxes. So in this case, he had to do that. We're working through a few other things. Perhaps we can find some things to offset that gain. But the bottom line here is looking backwards and saying coulda, woulda, shoulda. Let's make the best decision based on right this minute going forward. And for him, when we took that loss, it was to offset taxes that he for sure would pay out in the future rather than just going, well, I've got a stock that's down and I'm going to have to pay taxes.
I don't remember exactly how this happened in the movie, but I think it's when they're talking about, why, I think she's saying something like, why can't you be more normal or something like that. I think it's whenever he maybe beats up the guy for putting his hands on her. But anyway, Forrest says, what's normal anyway? And it's a great line. What is normal, right?
It is. And it really falls to the question. People ask us all the time, how much should I have to retire on? Well, $2 million, $1
Yeah.
million. So
Yeah, the normal says I should have $1 million, right, or something like that.
I don't look at it at all that way.
Well,
when I look at people, and like this past week, we went down to Lenore and visited a business and talked to the owners, and we got into retirement planning for the owners, and it was a fascinating conversation because they're not missing any meals. They're doing very well. So the goal that they had for annual income was pretty high. And so that was their normal. They had a lovely home, swimming pool, all this other stuff, and it was a great visit. But for them, it takes a lot of money to generate, $250,000 as an example a year. That's a lot of money, and so you have to look at that and say you need a big old pile of cash and some cash flow to give you that much money every year. Whereas if your goal for income is not that much, and most people it's not. I'll just be frank with you. If you said $75,000 a year, $125,000 a year, that's normally what we're hearing. And so if that's your income level that you want to have, what's normal is a lower amount. If you're trying to do the math on this, if you need $250,000 a year, you better have about $6.25 million to have a normal cash flow out of that and not burn the goose up and just instead eat the eggs. But the other side of it is comparing things to other people's
it will get you in trouble every single
approach
time.
is a bad move.
Let's talk about the last quote from Forrest.
What Mama always says, dying is a part of life. I sure wish it wasn't. So
Yeah, true.
I guess that's, if you're married especially, what happens if you lose a spouse? Usually, percentage-wise, there's a lot more women older age than there are men, so I guess men pass away sooner. And what happens? If somebody passes away, there's some significant changes. One of them is just dealing with that immediate change. So we had a client that passed away in Kentucky. He just had a heart attack and died. I mean, he wasn't really old. I mean, he was mid-70s. That's not very old to me.
Right.
And he just had a heart attack and died. And her daughter calls me crying, and I'm like, oh my gosh. I mean, I hadn't anticipated that happening at all. And we had to do some work. The beautiful part of that one was we had already done all the financial planning. All that stuff was...
And the estate planning.
All of that was done up front. We had all the trust in place. We had all the beneficiary things done well. And it was kind of over with pretty quick. And there were not a whole lot of things left undone and in probate and long time before you can close the estate. It was really... Given the fact that somebody passed away, it went real well.
And so the widow in this situation can really focus on just mourning the loss of a spouse and not having to deal with the headache and the financial concerns of how do we make this work and really push the mourning to a different time and not be able to address it. So that really worked out well.
One of the scenarios that we run is where you lose a spouse. It was almost exactly the scenario we ran. And so she already at least had an idea of how this should look when after he passed away. It's a hard thing to just say, but that's basically what we were trying to get to, is making sure that you've looked at this ahead of time and that you have, as best you can, done all the steps required, because it's going to happen.
If you're listening, I hope what you get from this segment is really financial planning is dealing with and preparing and addressing the things that can happen in your life. And it's not just about investments and how your assets are invested. There really is some planning going on.
Thank you so much for checking out the podcast today. If you have any questions about what we've discussed, remember, you can get a complimentary financial review with the team at Maestro Wealth Advisors by calling 336-448-1086. Or go online to howmoneyworksradio.com for other great resources and ways to reach the team. You can also check the show notes of today's episode for our contact information as well. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app so you never miss an episode. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the most popular apps. For Craig and Jennifer Moser, I'm Mark Killian. We'll talk to you next time on the How Money Works podcast.
Craig Moser is a financial advisor and certified financial planner. Securities offered through Avantax Investment Services, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Avantax Advisory Services. Insurance services offered through Avantax Affiliated Insurance Agency.